Well, I think if you're wondering how they received the film, I think that's your answer right there. First of all, thank you to everyone for coming out. It's great to see everyone here. And first of all, I didn't actually know whether to laugh or cry watching that movie because there were some moments that were just astonishing, I think eye-opening, disturbing, and at the same time, it's incredible to see the resilience from so many of the people here. And I want to thank you for bringing everyone here. As you guys probably noticed from the movie, I've been following this story very closely for the last couple of years. In fact, I've interviewed Bahia and Alan, so it's very nice to finally meet you in person. Thank you, Julia, for bringing us together. But quite a remarkable movie, and we certainly want to take questions from the audience. But I want to just kind of go down the line here with a few quick questions, and then we'll open it up. Julia, first of all, tell me about why you decided to make this movie and how it came in your line of sight.
First of all, thank you, Ayman, for joining and for being one of the only journalists that have been tracking this story.
Thank you.
I am going to answer your question.
Okay.
I am going to be brief, but I do need to recognize a couple of people first. The way I'm hoping to do this is I'm going to say a couple of names. If your name, please stand up. Let's wait for everybody to get up, and then we'll do a round of applause. There are many more people who could be sitting here, many more that I'm not even going to name here, but you know who you are. But I just wanted to acknowledge some people who are in the film, who are here with us in this room. First of all, Vince Warren, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Vince. Mohammed El-Badawi, Bahia's amazing husband. Laken Jordan, Mikkel's son. Ben Weiser, who is the director of the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. And I'm going to call a few people who are part of the incredible team. So Tiffany Fisher-Love, our co-producer. Amber Ferris, director of photography. Kelly West, cinematographer. Flavia De Souza, our editor. Mary Carr, associate editor. Gary Waller, our graphic designer. And I'm going to shout out to my husband, Lucas Welch, who made filmmaking possible with 2 kids during a pandemic. So thank you so much for being here. And, you know, I've been working with the team at Just Vision for now 17 years. We are a nonprofit media organization that wants to fill a media gap that we see in how coverage is done of Israel and Palestine. When we saw that there were growing attempts to silence the ability of Americans to advocate for the right of Palestinians, we very much wanted to be able to tell that story. And when plaintiffs across the country started taking the bold and courageous step of risking their livelihoods to challenge these bills, we very much knew we had a storyline to follow. And we simultaneously began looking at how these bills have come to pass with so little coverage. As I mentioned earlier, I think the short way of answering your question is we want more Aymans out there covering the story. We want the story to get journalists to pay attention. We want constituents to know that this is happening in their states. We want people to start showing up in their state legislatures to talk about this and to really bring attention to what is a tremendous threat to our ability to not only advocate for Palestinian rights, but to advocate in the future for other issues that we care about.
Brian, I wanted to ask you a question about Alan's case. And I think the 3 different profiles in the movie offer their own, I would argue, different reasons for challenging these lawsuits. I think each one of them, and I'll let them speak for themselves, but it seemed somewhat apparently different. From a legal standpoint, do you see all of them being the same, or is Alan's case different because he is being contracted and the state has the rights, as some have argued, that they don't necessarily have to pay someone if they want to engage in a boycott?
Well, so all of the plaintiffs in these cases were people who had government contracts in one way or another. Bahia had a contract to perform speech pathology services for the school district. Mick had a contract to provide services to incarcerated people for the county prison system, and Alan had a contract to provide advertising services to a local public university. And so in all of those cases, the government came forward and said, you may have a First Amendment right to boycott, but you don't have a First Amendment right to get a government contract. That is a line of reasoning that goes back a long ways. It goes back over 100 years, this idea of like, you have a First Amendment right to say whatever you want, but you don't have a First Amendment right to be a policeman. But in the McCarthy era, the Supreme Court roundly rejected that reasoning. And what they said is that the government's economic leverage can't be used to suppress people's speech on their own private time and dime. So the government can't come to you and say, hey, if you want to keep your job, you have to support the local sheriff, or you have to support the mayor, and you have to say, I'm a Republican if you want to keep this job. The Supreme Court said the government, those kinds of patronage systems, they're fundamentally un-American.
Even if it is a government job, just to be clear.
Even if it's a government job. But the government can regulate to some degree what you do on the job.
Right.
But when you're off the clock, when you're on your own time and dime, you have First Amendment rights, and the government has very little leeway to abrogate those rights.
And so to that point, Alan, bring us up to speed on where your case is. You and I have spoken a couple times over the year. I asked you that question about, as a journalist, I do not want to see the Arkansas Time closed under any conditions. So one way or the other, and I'm a big advocate of supporting local journalists, because without you and without the reporting you guys do, we wouldn't have much to talk about. So where is your legal case right now?
So the state was successful in asking for a rehearing before the full Eighth Circuit. And despite Brian's absolutely perfect logic, the questioning was pretty hostile. And we're not real optimistic about what's going to happen. We're waiting on that ruling. I mean, one of the judges, when we bring up constantly that part of the founding mythology of this country was a boycott of tea. And when Brian made that argument, one of the judges commented that he didn't think that would be constitutional today. So that gives me pause. And so we'll see what happens. But we're not backing down. I mean, we're going to go forward with what we're doing.
I want to say that I'm surprised when I hear American politicians in the legislative process about what motivates them, but just as an Arkansasian, what did you think of Brian Hester's reason for the reason he is pushing the BDS boycott?
I've heard that reasoning all my life as a Southerner, and it's sort of an unholy alliance between the evangelical right and the right-wing Israeli government. We can't have Armageddon. We can't have the second coming until Israel regains its biblical borders. That's basically the evangelicals have stitched together out of several books of the Bible this narrative. You can't find it in one place, but you can find it in several books from Revelations to Isaiah. So they support Israel as a way of bringing about Armageddon and the end times. Now, the Jews are going to burn. They understand that. So there's a little bit of must be some very awkward conversations sometimes between these people. But that's what Reverend Hagee and the rest of them, that's what they believe. And Israel, meanwhile, has a very, very powerful and potent political ally in the evangelical right for that very reason.
Mick, I want to come to you about a point that Brian just brought up, which is you're allowed to do what you want on your own time. And, they may have some say if you were doing some kind of activism on the government's clock. But in your case, you were doing everything, as I mentioned, and as the movie makes clear, completely on your own time. Has it impacted your work since then and your activism and organizing since then?
Well, I think getting a fabulous opinion, you guys should read this. I mean, it's just amazing out of Arizona. You got to skip the first 20 pages because it's all procedural, very boring. But in any case, I mean, it's just a fabulous opinion. And I think that armed me with the feeling that I could just go forward, without fear of, retribution or whatever, and just go forward. And I think my activism within the Arizona State Democratic Party has increased on the issue. We push to have a better national party platform on Israel-Palestine and called for the radical notion of equal rights for both peoples and security. And And it was interesting because this is in front of like 500 people, and there were people that spoke against it and called it anti-Semitic. Equal rights and security for both peoples was anti-Semitic. So there's something going on here. It's called the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which is just ridiculous. And it debases the true scourge of a very real anti-Semitism. So I think it, yeah.
Bahia, I wanted to come to you because in the movie we saw how brave and courageous your step was to come forward and what you were risking and what it meant for your family and your community. And I want you to talk to us a little bit about that experience since this ruling. Has it impacted your work? Has it impacted how the broader community in Texas views you and views your case?
As far as impacting my work, it did not. I'm working as a speech therapist, and actually, when I returned back to work at the same school district, I came back with open arms. I usually service students in different schools. I don't have one school that I go to, but when I walked into different schools, the janitor would say, "Well, come back to me." The secretary would say, "Hey, can I give you a hug?"
So they were following your case.
Yeah, exactly. People I'm not really in personal contact with or don't know on a personal level, they would just say, "Hey, I need you, give me a hug and we'll come back." And that was really humbling and very sweet of them. As far as my Muslim community, definitely it made them see the importance of being active and standing up. And I'm hoping that really encouraged them to do more than just go to the mosque and do the physical worships, but do besides that as well. Because we are in a place where we can make a difference, not just here locally, but even for countries, in their home countries as well. Because most decisions, so amazingly, the decision that happens in Palestine and other countries are actually made here in America. The laws are made here in America that impact people in Palestine or other countries. It really affects everyone in my Muslim community because their home countries are also, their laws are being made here, and what happens to them matters there.
For people who don't know, just to introduce the two guests at the very end, Daniel Chalfen and Suhad Babaa, two of the producers on the film. Brian, can I ask you just to pass your microphone down to Daniel? Let me start with you. Can you tell us what's next for the movie? Where are people going to be able to see it? Obviously, we have an amazing turnout here. A lot of people are going to want to follow this story very closely. Where will the film be distributed, and how will people across the country, around the world, be able to watch it?
Thank you for the question. Well, first, you all are the first people to see this film. So thank you for coming out. It's remarkable that you're all here, that you're all staying to listen to this incredible group of people. The film is going to hopefully come out in two different ways. The first is through the work that Just Vision has always done, which is through impact and through education, reaching communities, mosques, churches, synagogues all over the country and all over the world. And we're also hoping that with this film, I would say through persuasion and not coercion, buyers, distributors will see the importance of this story, see its national and global relevance, and give it a really big platform for us to see it. So we're waiting. We're early days in that, but hopefully it's going to be seen widely and broadly and discussed and make some changes. I
don't want to go off script here, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but when you do speak to distributors, have people shied away just because of the title, even without watching the movie? I mean, I know that just wanting to talk about BDS in of itself is controversial. Can you, if you want to, would you like to tell us how that process has been?
Well, fortunately, we only sent out the first emails on Friday. So
okay, all right.
I'm really pleased I don't have to answer that question.
All right, well, I'm going to follow up with you. I'm not going to let it go. But
have to follow up on that.
One of the most important things in this movie, for me at least, was the point that was made at the end, the template of how boycott law could easily be manipulated to impact other parts of our lives, whether it's Black Lives Matter, as you mentioned, Greenpeace, it could go on and on, fossil fuels, firearms. It's a scary thought as just somebody who works in the space of First Amendment, but I want you to talk to us a little bit about that concern. What have you started to see as a filmmaker is the trend for that type of constraint on our First Amendment rights as a result of this?
Thanks, Ayman, for the question. Before I take that question, I just want to actually say thank you to several people in this room, including those who've rallied around Just Vision, which Julia and I have the good fortune and great privilege of being leadership at. Just Vision has been, for those of you who are familiar with the organization, we have long been concerned around the crushing of voices of dissent related to Israel-Palestine. It's part of the reason that we believe so deeply that we need a platform where stories that accurately show what is happening on the ground in Israel-Palestine and courageous individuals who continue to advocate for change and to put a spotlight on those efforts. When we first started on this story, one of our concerns was both that these anti-boycott bills vis-a-vis Israel are the tip of the iceberg. Actually, the silencing of Palestinian rights advocates and those who are calling for change in Israel-Palestine go quite deeper, many of whom in this room have been working on for some time. We were also terrified, deeply concerned by the prospect of these bills becoming a template and a model for silencing dissent on issues across the board. Now remember, in 2015, when we first started to hear about these bills, they were just taking root in the United States. In fact, when we talked with lawyers and others who were tracking these bills, some were almost certain that they would be pushed back on because they violated our constitutional rights so deeply. And yet here we are, 33 states have adopted those laws. And in the last 6 months, we've seen bills being passed and introduced that punish companies that choose to boycott fossil fuels, that choose to boycott ammunitions industries. What does that mean? Those laws are actually curbing the work of activists and organizers who have been calling for climate change, for environmental justice, for gun safety in our communities for decades. And one of the things that we believe, and coming back to this question about what we hope to do with this film, this is a story both about Palestinian rights, but it's also a story about those who care about racial justice, about climate change, about reproductive rights. When I look at this film, I think about laws passing across this country under the radar in our state houses that don't actually represent the people. And we want to work with you. We want to partner. So if you want to screen these films, please do reach out and check us out at www.justvision.org. There's a sign-up list that's circulating, so please do use that QR code to follow us and reach out to info@justvision.org to set up a screening.
Thank you very much. So as I promised, we're going to take some questions from the audience. We don't have a lot of time left, but what I would like to do is, if we have a microphone on both sides, we may just take 3 questions, and then if we have time for more, we will come back. So I see one arm here. There's a lady right there in the back, and there's a lady right here on the front. So we'll start with this gentleman right here. Yep.
Okay, hi, thank you. This is for, I guess, anyone who wants to answer. Do you think this is going to become an issue in the next New York gubernatorial primary, with Kathy Hochul kind of doubling down on it? And do you think there's going to be, I don't know, do you think it's going to become a flashpoint? I think it is.
Do we have anyone who wants to wade into New York politics right now?
Do you think anyone's going to challenge her on it? Like, what are we?
So the first thing I'll note is that New York already has a version of these laws on the books. It was an executive order signed by former Governor Cuomo, saying essentially that any company that participates in a boycott of Israel will get put on a government blacklist, and then all the state's pension and investment funds will be divested from that company. Now, these divestment laws are different than the contracting laws, and to my knowledge, no lawsuit has been filed challenging one of the divestment laws. But I think it's, violates the spirit of the First Amendment for exactly the same reason that the judges found in Bahia's case and in Mick's case, and hopefully that the Eighth Circuit will eventually find in Allen's case. Whether or not New York will try to pass a more robust version of that applies even more broadly, that sweeps in contractors, it's certainly a possibility. I think in every legislative session, we see attempts to reintroduce this legislation, as Suhad was just saying, to expand it to other kinds of political issues. So I think this is unfortunately not something that's going to go away anytime soon. What we do have are 3 very, very strong district court decisions, actually I think 4 very, very strong district court decisions now, in Kansas and Arizona and Texas and Georgia, I believe, all saying that the First Amendment protects the right to boycott. That is, I would say, the consensus of the federal courts at this point. And so I'm hopeful, we will continue to go to those legislators and say, look, the courts are lining up on one side of this and you're getting on the other side, so you should really think twice.
There was a lady right here. Yep. Yes.
Thanks for taking my question. Hi, thank you. I always ask this question when we're talking about this. What exactly is BDS? How does it work on the ground, and has it been successful, quote unquote?
Okay. Alan is like, why don't you take that? So I think the film started answering a little bit, but I'll repeat some of what it was said. So BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It started in 2005. It was a call by Palestinian civil society to the international community to hold Israel accountable using tactics that have worked, and that what inspired them was the struggle, international struggle to end apartheid in South Africa that used boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I think that there's been growing adoption to that call, particularly as people around the world have noticed that there's no other way of putting pressure, as governments, as international institutions have washed their hands, as Arab countries and Arab institutions have washed their hands. I think it's become increasingly clear to individuals and civil society at large internationally that people need to act, that it is time to respond to the call from Palestinian civil society to put pressure and try to hold Israel accountable to its human rights violations.
There was a lady right here as well.
Thank you for this incredibly important film. I'm just so moved by it. In the 1980s, the media-making community was a significant part of the cultural boycott of South Africa. And what I'm not understanding, and I don't know if any of you can speak to this directly, is why even within the documentary portion of the media-making community today, there is no real activism around boycott. It's horrifying. And, you know, we're at a time where we're talking about ethics, 5 days a week. This just seems to me, it defies logic. This community has to show some leadership in this respect.
So, okay, thank you so much. I appreciate the question.
Maybe you should answer that.
I'd like to.
Yeah, go ahead, Alan. You're a member of the press. Take it.
Yeah. So this law is sort of pernicious in that it also really targets the press. So in our city, we're fortunate to have a locally owned daily newspaper, and we have a locally owned business journal, both of whom have signed the pledge, because publishing is very difficult and they need that money, and I understand that. So they've been very loath to offer much support for us because they would look like hypocrites. And so I think the press sometimes is going to back away from this particular issue because they themselves have been forced to participate in their own self-censorship.
We have time for 2 more questions, I believe. This lady right here. And if there's a gentleman right here in the back over there.
A wonderful film, very crucial. Now, in the film, you showed the young man in Israel, a Jewish man, who was working for you. I mean, that has just exposed the corruption of the Israeli government. Could you please speak who he is? Because I didn't understand his identity and whether he's working alone. And secondly, briefly comment on Ben and Jerry, please.
So Itamar does not work for us. He is an independent investigative journalist with the Seventh Eye, a very well-respected media watchdog in Israel. He was engaged in his own research when I first got the chance to talk to him 3 years ago when we started making this film. It took 3 years for him to actually get the documents that you saw revealed in the film. So while we were editing during the pandemic, in July of last year was when the documents were finally released. So he's been at it, really doing serious journalistic work on the ground, and we're incredibly grateful that he allowed us to share what he found through his FOIA request. Ben and Jerry's, maybe Suhad or Mikkel?
Sure, absolutely. For those of you who are not familiar with the Ben & Jerry's story, Ben & Jerry's decided to not renew its contract to sell ice cream in the West Bank in an act of principled decision-making to align its business values to international law, which deems Israeli settlements in the West Bank as illegal. Now, there has been wide pushback around Ben & Jerry's decision, including top Israeli government officials, as well as states, politicians here in the United States, who have railed against the company for its decision, under the same accusations that unfortunately Mick had faced around being called potentially anti-Semitic, and Lakin actually mentions it in the film. Unfortunately, under those auspices, states in this country, Arizona, New Jersey, for example, have started to pull their funding from Unilever through their pension plans. This is real. It's playing out in our backyard. It has consequences and ramifications. When we're talking about the fossil fuels and firearms bills that have passed, banks, tech companies that have contracts with places like Texas may be impacted. We are just seeing, again, the tip of the iceberg. We have the ability at this point to put a spotlight on this. You know, so much of what is happening now is really because of these laws happening under the radar. Most people we talk to don't know about it. And so we hope that we're able to put a spotlight on it and get ahead of things like Ben & Jerry's.
Mick, you wanted to add to that real quick?
Suhad, did I hear there's going to be a bunch of Ben & Jerry's in the lobby after this? But, actually, I wanted to say...
Is Chunky Monkey your favorite?
Yeah, well, I think we need a new name, right? I think there's a competition on that due to this. But in any case, there was a question about BDS. BDS is not the only, it's one movement. It's a major movement. But there are also many groups, and there are 10 Protestant mainstream denominations in this country that boycott settlement products, illegal Israeli settlement products. They limit their boycotts to what's going on in the West Bank. And that's what Ben & Jerry's did, too. They're not boycotting Israel. The West Bank is not Israel, believe it or not. So, I mean, I think it's important to realize there's a whole bunch of ways to boycott. And, so that's important. So.
There was a gentleman here who had his hand up. I don't know, sir, if you still want to ask that question, but we'll make this the final question just because we're a little bit pressed for time. This gentleman right here, if you can put your hand up, sir, so she can find you. Yeah.
Thank you. I hate to make it the last question. Maybe you can go after this. But I first wanted to just, as a non-filmmaker, I was not just incredibly impressed by the importance of the film, but the production of it was just beautiful and just amazing. I mean, the editing and the music, and I don't know how you did it in 3 years. So that's first of all. But I did want to ask a question going forward, and I was struck by, I think it was Brian's statement at the end, and the combination of how tenuous the situation was that really relied on the courts to rule the way they did. But Brian's statement at the end saying, well, it really requires individuals to be active and really take the action. I'm just struck by the unprecedented gun purchasing in the last 18 months, which has been unprecedented. And right now, the legal issue that apparently is before the courts in cases like Rittenhouse, where self-defense using guns is not clear.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you just because I know you said that you didn't want that to be the last question, and I certainly appreciate that. But if we can keep it to the movie for a second, and do you have a question specifically about the movie, or would you like us to take another question from someone else in the audience?
Okay, why don't you take another question?
Thank you. I appreciate it. I know a lot of people have very strong opinions, and it's a powerful movie because it invokes so many opinions about so many different issues. But if there's this gentleman right here will make this the last question. Thank you.
Hi, Julia. Thank you so much
Judy.
for all of you. Hi, dear. I just want to say that I really appreciate it, and it was so beautiful and important. And I'm an Israeli Jew, and I'm so aware to the apartheid in Palestine and Israel, occupied Palestine and Israel. And I think it's important when you fight for the First Amendment and everything to know that I will fight for BDS, even it will be against the Constitution of America. So it's very important. So thank you so much for this film.
Not a question, but we'll end on that note. Thank you so much.
And the question is, how can I help you? That was the question.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Thank you. Congratulations to you on the movie. Thank you, guys.